So my name's Gareth Chick. I'm founder and managing partner of Collaborative Equity, and I've recently published two books, which are my life's work of 40 years experience in the corporate world, both as CFO, CEO, chairman, consultant, trainer, coach, manager, everything.
Fantastic.
I always knew that I wanted to work in business. I got my first dream job when I was 12 years old. I badgered my local greengrocer because I wanted to be the one out front, serving the customers and twirling the brown paper bags full of vegetables, which I loved. And I got some advice. I did my first psychometric test at 16. And I got some advice to train as an accountant and move into general management. And that's what I did. And I was a man on a mission. I was a very young CFO. I was a CFO at 24. And at 28, I was CFO of a PLC subsidiary in the UK. And I was very successful. I was very driven. I was very controlling. And I was very arrogant. And I got sent on a leadership course. I really didn't want to go. I behaved quite badly on the first morning of the course because I honestly thought I was better than everybody there, and didn't they know how busy I was and how important I was. And thankfully, the instructor on the course, a gentleman named Walter Blackburn, took me to one side and gave me probably my first piece of very tough feedback. And he told me to grow up or go. And I decided that maybe this was the time. That was 34 years ago. The language of leadership development in those days was slightly different. We didn't really talk about coaching. We didn't really talk about emotional intelligence, but that's what that leadership course gave me. I was so inspired by it that I asked if I could train to learn how to run the course and deliver it to other people. And so for the next 14 years, I had a very weird career. I was a full-time CFO, general manager, ops director, and then chief executive for 12 years. And my hobby was running leadership programs for Dale Carnegie Training, and in which I met a lot of my current clients, who are currently, PLC, board members. Came through leadership courses with me, 20, 25 years ago. What I realized while I was delivering the leadership courses was that I was the material was great, but that I was coming to it from a slightly different angle because I was in the day-to-day pressure. And I really identified with the hard-pressed managers that were in front of me in the leadership courses. And I realized that a leadership course, it wasn't enough just to win the intellectual argument. Most managers know how to coach and they know how to lead authentically. They just can't do it when the pressure's on. And so I noticed what I was really developing was a particular style of leadership training and coaching training that was coming from a place of understanding the psychological effects of being constantly under pressure. And that was the start of my sort of journey of research. I did a huge amount of research into neuroscience, into psychotherapy. When I decided to step down from my last chief executive role, I fully intended to go back and run another big business. That's who I thought I was. And I got very busy doing consulting work because I had a ready-made client base, all the people who'd been through courses with me. And then I got offered two chairman's jobs, which really appealed to me. One was a private equity, very nice software business, which I chaired for 8 years, floated it on the AIM market, and then did a trade sale. And I also chaired a social housing organization, which was a delight. It was a tenant-led housing association, which was brilliant. So for the last 20 years, I've done a mix of sort of chairing jobs, I've done consulting, and I've developed further particularly my training products around coaching. And a lot of big companies have taken this coaching course that I wrote, including Google. I spend probably about 20% of my time now working with Google all around the world. I've coached about 30 of their vice presidents all around the world. And I have the most blessed and lucky life. I travel the world meeting fantastic people. They become vulnerable to me very quickly, and that's an extraordinarily privileged place to work. I have no anxiety in my work, and I still remember the stresses and anxieties of being a chief executive. I don't miss that. My ego misses the power and being able to throw my weight around a bit. But I'm happy to do the deal that a stress-free life is more than compensation. I wrote my first book, which is called "And the Leader Is," which has actually just been published between sort of 5 and 10 years ago. And I then realized I couldn't really let that out first. I had to put another book out first, and that became the book called Corporate Emotional Intelligence, Being Human in a Corporate World, which is, I think, where I met Kate Murden, who came across my book. And it's an analysis of the psychology of the corporate world and why decent, honourable, ethical people come to behave in abnormal and sometimes even aberrant ways simply because they have power and control. It was a world I knew very well.
Why couldn't you publish "And the Leader Is" first? Why did you have to do it the other way around?
Because there are a million books on leadership out there. And I knew that, while my book is good, it's just in a way, it's just another book on leadership, how to lead, how to coach, how to build teams, how to change organizations, how to change cultures. And I knew that actually my 40 years in the corporate world, what was really unique about me was my discovery of what I call unconscious controlling habits, and that really needed to be explained. And so emotional intelligence, which is very much has come to the fore in the last few years in corporations, in my view, is not enough. Emotional intelligence, fundamentally based on self-awareness and self-regulation, but primarily when people have an opportunity to calm themselves down and get into a space where they can think rationally. And most managers these days are so under pressure all the time that they need a deeper and different emotional intelligence. They need corporate emotional intelligence. And so that's why I felt I had to write that book first and get that book out. And so they're really two parts of a single work. I always intended to write just the one book, but my publisher decided that persuaded me eventually that they should become two.
And so that subconscious habits, did you say? Controlling habits? Unconscious?
Yes, the way that they're easy to remember is the acronym is, so our unconscious controlling habits. The acronym is OUCH, which is so a little easier to remember. And so when I'm working with a group of people and I ask them, so I've asked this question, Dominic, thousands of times to probably tens of thousands of managers across the world. What is your worst habit as a manager when you are under pressure? And the beauty of that question is that once people just get past their little sort of scouty answer when they sort of test their audience or whether they can be absolutely vulnerable, all managers know what they do under pressure, and they know that what they're doing under pressure is not growing their people. It gets the job done today, but it doesn't develop people. And so they have to sort of defer the people development side until the pressure is off. And of course, the pressure is never off. So I identified 3 prime unconscious controlling habits. And I outline them in the book as the 4 pillars of corporate emotional intelligence. And step 1, or pillar 1, is self-awareness around these habits. And they're very simple. The first is we ask closed questions. And when a manager asks a closed question, it's not a genuine question. There's no curiosity about whether the answer is yes or no. It's a completely controlling device. And in fact, most managers will tell you what the right answer is in the tone of voice they use to ask the question. So it's not a question. it's a controlling device. And closed questions have become our prime controlling tool as managers. So when I do a very simple exercise and I ask managers to do a little 10-minute exercise, say, coach your partner, let's make it real. Your subject matter will be your partner's most pressing business problem as they sit here today. So that makes it real. And managers immediately come under the pressure to want to be helpful. And I say it's very simple, no closed questions. Just ask open questions. And I've had grown men and women, sobbing on the floor, beating their hands, physically saying, I can't do it. I can't ask open questions. Well, you can, but I understand that your brain is fried at the moment. And while your brain is fried, all that will come out will be closed questions and statements. The second of the habits that we have is filling silences. And when you're using the survival part of your brain, when you're under huge amounts of pressure and you've got adrenaline flowing around your body and you've got cortisol flushing your brain as a stress hormone, and you ask, even if you ask somebody a question, if there is 2 or 3 seconds of silence, the manager will then continue to speak. So they've just completely hijacked. I've asked you this great question. It's really made you think. You need a few moments to stay calm, to access the neocortex, to access all that information that's in your brain in non-verbal form. It's not in language. Bring it into your prefrontal cortex, turn it into language and articulate it. I can't even wait 3 seconds. And so managers have 2 ways typically that they will fill a silence. One is that they will answer their own question, which is so much quicker. Considering most managers rarely ask a question to which they don't already know the answer. These are, just become controlling tools. So Dominic, if I were to, do this to you, I might say to you, so Dominic, you've got this really important client meeting coming up tomorrow. How are you going to open the meeting? Are you going to use that? You're going to use that slide deck that we went through? You see, why don't I just ask you how you're going to open the meeting? But I can't, because you might say, oh, well, that's very. How am I going to open the meeting? And my brain's going, oh, for God's sake, it wasn't a hard question. We prepared for this. So why would I give you the opportunity to be frustrating to me? So I just answer you. I'll answer my own question. The other way we have of filling a silence is to make a motivational statement. So if I ask you, Dominic, how are you going to open that really important client meeting tomorrow, and you go quiet because you're having to think about it, and my brain says, oh, Dominic, this is crazy. We've talked about this. If you're not ready, if the answer isn't right there, clearly you're not motivated at the moment. Clearly you don't have the same sense of urgency that I have. So I know what I'll do is I'll make a motivational statement to inject you with some urgency, and then you'll be able to give me the right answer. And it would sound something like this. So Dominic, really important client presentation tomorrow. How are you going to open the meeting? Because Dominic, I'll tell you now, I know Charlie and I've known him for a long time. If you don't grab his attention right in the first few seconds of the meeting, you're toast, my friend. Sorry, now that I've motivated you and I've stressed to you the urgency of the situation, now you'll be able to say, oh, well, I'm going to use that slide deck that we went through the other day. Right answer, Dominic. That's brilliant. Good. What a great coach I am. And the final habit that we have is we give multiple inputs. We seem incapable, physically incapable, of asking one question, allowing the person to think, listening to their answer, and responding to the response that they've given us. So I see managers and they start talking, they ask a question, they ask an open question, followed by a closed question, followed by 3 statements, another open question, and then a closed question. And because under pressure, my survival brain is trying to get all of the information out, give you all the context. Otherwise, I may forget something, and that means that I'm no longer in control. Well, all I know is if my boss has got a bit of stress going on, and my boss asks me 4 questions in a row, I know which one I'm going to answer. I'm going to answer the easy one. I'm going to answer the one where I can please my boss, put a smile back on their face, convince my boss that actually I am in control, even though there's a couple of questions that my boss asked me that would cause me to struggle a little bit, and I do not like to struggle in front of my boss. Normally, when I go through that, what happens, Dominic, is the identification comes up immediately. Managers say, "God, I do these things," and when they realise that everybody else around them, me included, these are the habits that come from being under pressure. It takes away the shame. It takes away the guilt. Managers carry a lot of shame and guilt because they know how they should be with their people, but they're not like that under pressure. They know that they're either over-controlling, over-aggressive, making the other person do what they want them to do, or they're over-passive. They say, give it to me, I'll do it, I'll take it away, I'll do it myself. And managers will fall into basically one of those camps. And if you strip psychometric profiling down in terms of its basics, people will predominantly either become over-aggressive or they will become over-passive. I'm going to make you do it, or I will do it myself. And this is the way I get control back in a moment of pressure.
It seems to me, though, that the behaviours you describe have probably been learnt on the job, because nobody has ever pointed out to those managers before that there's another way to do it, and it's just how somebody managed them. So when you get promoted to be a manager, you just do what was done to you. Absolutely, and it's called conforming to a corporate culture. I don't think I've Googled this on the internet. I don't think you can go on a course that teaches you how to ask closed questions. I don't think such a thing exists. They haven't been trained, definitely.
They haven't been trained. Nowhere I've never seen it in corporate values. Thou shalt use controlling techniques. These are completely learned behaviors. So one of the bizarre things that happens on a training course is I get people say, I get this, but how do I make open questions more natural? And I say, but open questions are natural. It's your controlling habits that are unnatural. There isn't any other walk of life that you would go about having these weird conversations with people. It comes because you have power. It comes because you have an issue around your self-image and proving your value as a manager. And if all you do is ask questions, somebody's going to say to me, well, I thought you're supposed to be smarter than I am. You certainly get paid more than I do. And all you do is ask questions. What value is that? So managers have got a real self-esteem issue here, but nobody has pointed this out to them before. The moment they get confronted with those unconscious controlling habits, the moment they realize physically that they are not in the habit of asking open questions. So even a simple 10-minute open question exercise. And I ask people the question, because I don't have to teach them the difference. And I prove to them that they're very good at open questions by asking them this question: at what age were you at your very finest as an asker of open questions? And people know, 3 years old. 3-year-old kids, 3-year-old kids ask they ask exquisite open questions. Why? Because they're curious, they want to learn, they have no shame about you thinking that they don't know. And unfortunately, 30, 40, 50 or 60 years later, we arrive in corporate positions. And the last thing we want to show is vulnerability. So I can't ask you a question and have you think that I don't know the answer to it. So these controlling habits, we get so much practice at them, we become brilliant at them. And the real dilemma is we're so brilliant at them, we do hit short-term targets. And so we survive. And the worst types of managers quite often get rewarded because they're so hard driving. And I was one of those managers in my 20s. They're so hard driving, they get the job done, they can even exceed expectations for a short period of time until everybody burns out, or actually, thankfully, these days, somebody puts their hand up and says, please don't treat me like that anymore. And thankfully, the corporate world is now, starting to wake up to the fact that there is an immense amount of abuse and bullying and intimidation going on, and there has to come a point where it's not acceptable anymore.
Yeah. And so just taking you back on your corporate journey, you've had you worked for a lot of big companies. Are your clients now, do they tend to be like Google? Do they tend to be senior leaders in large companies?
Yes. So that's really my sweet spot, is very large multinationals and senior leaders running organizations of 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, people. So I will work with smaller organizations where there is a personal introduction. So one of my clients or somebody I know says, look, there's a company over here, they're really struggling, or this guy's really struggling. Will you work with them? Yes, I will. And frequently I'll do that either with no fee or a very small fee, but only where that comes through a personal recommendation.
And I'm surprised, because I would have thought if you were a senior leader in a big company, your sort of your desire to be vulnerable is potentially even lower than somebody on the way up in a smaller organization. How do they end up coming to you? Does somebody nominate them for some Gareth love, or do they put their hands up and say, I'd like to understand how to be better at this?
I think there's sort of two elements. So there is a cohort at senior levels in organizations where, and this is a slightly unkind comment. It's not quite as bad as this. A few years ago, if I go back 10 or 15 years, when I was starting to do one-to-one executive coaching, which I noticed that I was coaching my clients without necessarily calling it that or even billing it separately. And so I thought, yes, when people said, will you do some coaching? I think there was a time back then when it became fashionable, to have a coach. I've reached my C level. I've ordered the big car and I've got my coach, and almost worn like a sort of ego badge. It's not like that. In some pockets, it still is. There is a real desire on the part of senior leaders and their companies. The senior leadership role is a very stressed role, and in terms of well-being, there's a lot more cognizance these days about executive stress and about the loneliness that goes into that place. And who does an executive have to talk to? They can't really talk to their boss, because their worry is that they'll show weakness, and secondly, that going to your boss and saying, I'm not sure how I feel about this, or I'm not sure what to do about this. Their experience normally is they either get punished for that, well, what do you mean you don't know? You're the chief executive. Or the person will step in and tell them what to do, neither of which are very helpful. Whereas being able to say to their coach, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm spent, I am bereft of ideas, and be accepted in that moment as a decent, normal human being is an amazingly powerful. So there is an element, absolutely, of sort of therapy to this. There is a therapeutic element. Most of the training I've done in the last 10 years has been in psychotherapy, not in management. And for their companies, knowing that there is some responsibility that they've had in putting some well-being support around the executive. So most of the clients I get, I would say, come from a very positive view of I'm just being promoted. I'd really want to just help with this. I do a lot of coaching one-to-one with first-time chief executives, because that's again a sort of sweet spot for me. Very occasionally, I'll get a call from a client saying, we have a talented person. They are probably, if they don't correct their fault, then they will be fired. So I sit and do a three-way with the client. My terms are I'll work with that person, but only if they've been told the truth. I'm not going to sort of be slunk in as some sort of manipulative, device. But that's quite rare. I think the attitude and the culture around corporate workplaces, it's changed a lot, certainly over my 40 years, for good and bad. I think the good side is there is much more awareness of mental health issues and stress levels, and physically what corporate workplaces are doing to people. On the other hand, the dissociation, of course, still in terms of real sort of ownership and the markets and the analysts and the hedge funds and the investors. It's still the pressure actually still. It's, in my view, gets worse and worse. And we've had the digital revolution of the last 5 years. The ubiquitous smartphone has come along and changed, radically, the way that people are having to work. And if you work in a multinational now, you are basically never really off duty. You have, if you're in the UK, if you're working for a US business, then you're doing video calls into the evening with your illustrious West Coast colleagues who really don't give they don't care what time it is in Europe. They don't even know what time it is in Europe, really. And of course, with the technology, I remember the days when you could sit on a conference call at 9 o'clock at night with, watching the television, with your family, and sort of nodding every now and again or grunting every now and again, at least to let them know you were still on the call. Of course, with video calls, you can't do that now. So it's much more pernicious. And then, the APAC, wakes up. And so, you're having to jump on a call at 7 in the morning, sometimes with your APAC colleagues as well. And this is the life of, of the certainly the big sort of tech businesses, the big accountancy businesses, the big petrochemical businesses, anything, the big consumer brands these days that are global. If you're a manager in that world, you are 24/7, and you're running really high levels of adrenaline and cortisol for way longer than we were ever biologically designed to do. And it has got worse even in the last 5 years, in my view.
Yeah, and there's no sign that it's going to get better. There'll be something will happen and people will take notice. But before, there was one thing that I wrote down when I was doing some prep, which is, I think, could be wrong, I think that you've got a take on organizational structure and the impact that has on culture.
Yes. I suppose, Dominic, there are two aspects to that. One is around governance at the very top, and then one is around, the way teams are organized. And I'm a great fan of self-managed teams. I have put self-managed teams into organizations myself. Every organization I've run, I have radically reduced the number of management positions and increased the size of teams and put lots of stuff around self-managed teams into place. So if I'm running retail outlets or stores, and the work I've done with various retailers, what I'm always looking at is actually what value is this manager adding? And there are so many management positions that end up getting in the way of innovation and ownership, in a store or in a business unit. So I'm very keen on driving very high levels of employee engagement and innovation through self-managed teams. And then in corporate governance terms, because I've been a chairman a number of times, and I would count, I'm 62 years old. When I look back at my career, I'm very proud of the 2 books I've written because they are the synthesis of my 40 years. If you ask me for my, the role where I'm at my most effective, it's in the role of chairman. And I have very strong views around governance, depending clearly on ownership structures or lending structures, but everybody's got somebody to answer to, even if it's an institutional shareholder or a bank that they owe money to. and the management of those dissociated personalities who can come to not care that much about how people are being treated in their organization. And the corporate structure, puts dissociation into the mix. And it is exactly the same as the dynamic, Dominic, where, I can go to, and I won't name a store, I can go to a store, I can buy a T-shirt for £4. If I had to buy that T-shirt directly from the 9-year-old girl in Bangladesh who made it, I may change my behavior. But I don't have to, do I? If I had to, every time I switch my mobile phone on, if I had to go to the 12-year-old Nigerian boy who's, with a gun at his head, going into mine coltan out of a mine so that I can have a mobile phone, I would change my behavior, but I don't have to. So there is, in my view, the role of corporate governance has really got to look at how we are engaging with the consumer world. And so my keynote speech that I do as a result of being asked to do lots around the book is called Waking Up in a Corporopathic World. And I link the corporate structures and corporate history to the things that we are currently doing to ourselves, the extinction, climate change, plastic, and they are the same thing. We have ended up choking our oceans, well, not our oceans, of course, but oceans in the developing world, with plastic. We are 60% of species on the planet close to extinction. Climate change possibly just past the point where we have any chance of really doing something. Tens of hundreds of millions of people are going to have to change the way they operate. They're going to be forced to, because of the way we have organized ourselves corporately. So I don't blame the corporation as in itself. I blame corporatism as the ill.
So that's both of those, I think, are absolutely fascinating. I've got two final questions which I ask all of my guests. One is, if you could go back in time, knowing what you know now, is there a point where something you know now would have been really useful then?
I don't want to sound like a fatalist. I think the issue is, Dominic, it's really easy for me, after 40 years of refining and iterating and learning, it's quite easy for me to now, pontificate about these things. I'm not sure, I was an ordinary jobbing executive, for many years. I wasn't intent on changing the world. I believe that I ran the companies I ran and the thousands of people that were involved. I know I can put my hand on my heart and say I behaved as ethically as possible and treated people really well and brought the best out in them. I made lots of mistakes. In my early days, there are 2 or 3 occasions which I would still wince about in the way that I treated people. I mean, nothing inappropriate, but just decisions that impacted their lives that I did without really giving sufficient, humanity to the decision. I got very excited when Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997. It sort of, for me, this was the repeat of what my parents described as the 1945 moment. My parents were both very staunch Labour supporters. Lived, on the that cataclysmic time. They both lived through the Second World War actively. They were in the forces for 5 or 6 years, and the moment in 1945 when the country said no to Winston Churchill and installed a Labour government. And for me, 1997 was that moment, and I had a sort of fantasy about maybe I could, as I saw Tony Blair go off the rails, in my view, maybe, I could sort of do something about that. And I made a few tentative, approaches, but nothing came back. I don't have any regrets. What I'm trying to do now is be as evangelistic about this, and bring the message to as many people as I can. And all I can do really is, the people I touch, which is why I'm still, herring around the world at the drop of a hat. I'll go and talk to 50 people, for a day and anywhere, is just trying to sort of bring that message and give people the identification and the empowerment that the new generations need. Thankfully, Generation X, Generation Z, or the ones coming through, if we haven't completely, taken the planet past a certain point, I'm very optimistic about, the generations of younger managers coming through. Their principles and their values are much less materialistic than my generation was. I count my own children. I have 4 children, and I count them in that space. They range between 20 and 35, and I'm in awe of the way that they're living their lives of integrity. So they may just come and save me.
In the last few minutes, because I know you've got to go in 5 minutes, but the other thing is, you, as you say, you spent 40 years learning and honing. Maybe there are 3 books that stand out that you think other people should pick up and digest?
Yes, very happy. And so the number 1 book that I recommend to everybody, and I have personally given away over 200 copies, is a book called Maverick by Ricardo Semler. I first read Maverick in 1995, and I was on my 3rd iteration as a chief exec, and it made complete sense of everything that I believed, but I hadn't quite still had the confidence to do. It is the single greatest book ever written on employee engagement, in my view. I could go back to a book that had a profound effect on me, which was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which I first read in 1982 or something like that. And I worked with the Dale Carnegie organization, for 10 years, and I proudly held a license to deliver their leadership programs. I think if I were to go one more, so you'll see on the wall behind me is a little RSA animation of a book called Drive by Dan Pink. The reason I love his book, Drive, is it's very easily digestible. I have to say, unlike Corporate Emotional Intelligence, which is not the most easily digestible book in the world, so helpful. And he talks about the 3 elements of motivation: autonomy, meaning, and mastery. And for me, that was, it's a fantastic book. I would encourage anybody to watch the little 10-minute RSA animation of the book Drive. I could talk about 2 or 3 others, but those would probably be the 3.
Gareth, that's fantastic. We'll find the automation and the animation, and we'll link to it in the show notes. Gareth, thank you very much indeed for giving me your time today and being a guest on The Melting Pot.
It's been a great pleasure, Dominic. Thank you very much for asking me.